Now, once again, Raymond Arroyo.
Welcome back to The World Over Live. Pope Francis is meeting with the world's cardinals in Rome. They're calling it Curial Reform Week. We'll explore what he's doing, what we can anticipate, and much more with Bishop Robert C. Morlino of Madison, Wisconsin. Welcome back to the program,
Great
Bishop.
to see you, Raymond.
Let's start with this so-called Reform Week. The Pope has created 20 new cardinals. 15 of those will be new electors. Well, let's start there. This is obviously the longest lasting impact of what we're seeing this week, is the appointment of these new cardinals. What do these men tell us about the Pope's vision for the Church? Most of them hail from the peripheries, as the Pope likes to call them, 18 countries in all. What do you make of those appointments?
Well, I think, first of all, understanding what he means by the peripheries is not actually the easiest thing in the world. It doesn't simply mean the margins of society. It means something deeper than that, actually. Something where a part of humanity that has been ignored and neglected is now being looked to as having something of significant value to contribute in the discussion. And to say that we should go out to the peripheries is a mindset more than it is I think, a sociology program. I think that where do we go looking to evangelize? Not the comfortable places, not the places where it's easier for us to use whatever techniques we think we've learned or anything like that. But where should we go with the faith in our heart that really can transform people? And I have to say, in all honesty, that out on the peripheries, and I shouldn't even say out because that's a spatial image, but at the peripheries, there's much more openness to an honest faith sharing that comes from the heart. And that seems to be Pope Francis's goal and his style. It comes right from the heart. It's always directed to the individual or group who are sitting right in front of him. I don't get the impression that Pope Francis is speaking to the universal church very often. He seems to be focused on bringing the group or the individual who are with him closer to Jesus, period. And that's a beautiful model for evangelization, but that is a model that is almost impossible for the media to work with because they want to take every word that he says and turn it into doctrine almost immediately. And, you know, as the Pope consoles some little child about the death of her dog, they make it into a
all dogs go to heaven.
Solemn pronunciation that all dogs are going to heaven. So at that sense, in that sense, he's at the mercy of a media that, for the most part, except for great individuals like you, wants to misrepresent him and misinterpret him and give our American culture and society especially what they want. You know, they want to get the blood in the water for the sharks.
Yeah, and everybody can kind of have a good time with it. Some Vatican watchers are saying these men, these new appointments, the 15 electors being appointed, that they represent a pastoral vision of the Church. These are men who are far more pastoral, and they are not tied to nor terribly interested in the theological. Would you agree with that?
I don't know them well enough to agree with that, but I would say that only, as Pope Benedict said, only what is true can ultimately be pastoral. And we cannot carry out something else and call it pastoral if it does not embody the truth. One of the problems that the media are causing with synod reporting is that the Pope sees some difference between, well, I shouldn't put it that way, but the Pope sees a distinction between doctrine and practice such that doctrine cannot change, but the practice can.
Right.
Certain doctrines are embodied in certain practices, and even if you don't change the doctrine in writing, in a written document, If you change the practice, you have changed what the previous practice embodied.
Right, and what the doctrine is, in fact.
And so we have to be very careful about that. But it seems to me, when the Pope speaks doctrinally, intentionally, as he did in the Philippines about marriage and in his support of the Slovakian provision that would ban same-sex unions, I think he's being the true teacher of doctrine. When he gets in a room with this group of homeless people or with this group of Islamic people, everything he says is tailored to them, somehow to draw them closer to the God of truth. And we have to make a lot of distinctions with this Holy Father about who it is he's actually speaking to, what his goal actually is. I believe completely that he knows that the doctrines of the Church cannot change, and how this is going to work itself out at the Synod, I don't exactly know. But the one who does know how it will work out is the Holy Spirit. And however it works out, the Holy Spirit will use it for some good. So as always, I'm of good cheer.
Oh, I can tell. Before we get to the Synod on the Family, which I do want to get to in a moment, let's talk about this reform group that met this week, the Pope's accountability for clerical sex abuse. That commission met this week. They are recommending, demanding, that there be firm bishop accountability. Bishops who violate the norms accepted by their conference, that something be done, some penalty be extended. Your thoughts on this?
Well, I think one has to be very careful because bishops govern by divine right. The will is revealed through the Pope, but God calls the bishop of a diocese to that diocese by name. The Holy Father is the instrument, but he is not the initiator of that call. That call comes from God. And that's why in the past, when it comes to disciplining bishops, it's not so easy, because how do you discipline the one whom God has put there, presumably having God's confidence? Now, there are bishops who have done very reprehensible things and who ought to be disciplined.
And who have been.
And who have been. But the important thing is, how does it happen? And it seems to me that there has to be some kind of a procedure to which the bishop has a right. And if that procedure turns out to have negative consequences for the bishop, so be it, because we have to keep the trust of the people of God. We have to let them believe that we are good and faithful shepherds, especially when it comes to taking good care of the children and not allowing for any abuse in that area whatsoever. I don't think that we should see ourselves as at the whim of some complaint that might be offered, because we know that many priests have had false allegations made against them. And I know of at least one bishop who's had some very terrible false allegations lodged against him. And I think that bishop has a right to a procedure that will unveil the truth, and a procedure perhaps which would not begin with the Pope's decision but would end with the Pope's decision, so that the bishop would have a chance to appeal whatever the process led to, whatever decision the process led to. But there's no question that bishops need to be held accountable. And I think the best way for it to happen is through brother bishops who are friends and brother bishops in the region under the metropolitan. I think that would be the best way to have this accountability, because it could take place for the most part in a context which is not poisoned against the bishop by the media or any other factor.
I want to move on now to the Synod on the Family. There's been a lot of reporting in recent days. We see people, I don't think it's too strong a word, lobbying internationally and traveling all around, sort of plying the case. The central goal, if you will, remains the same: to extend communion to divorced and remarried Catholics without a full or fulsome process, tribunal process that would grant the annulment. So the question remains, we have Bishop Marks here in the United States just at the end of last month, and he is still pushing this Casper plan, as are a number of others. But I want to put this quote up because he goes a bit further in this interview with America Magazine. He says, "I'm astonished that most of our young people, and also Catholic homosexuals who are practicing, want a relationship that lasts forever. We must begin with the main points of the doctrine to see the dream. The dream is to have a person say, a man and woman say, you and you forever, you and you forever. And we as church say, yes, that's absolutely okay. Your vision is right." What do you see there?
Well, if means to say that if two people of the same sex say yes to each other forever, or if two people who are not married somehow say yes to each other forever but short of marriage, well, then I think that's wrong. I think that's just a mistake on his part. Because it's very clear from the book of Genesis and forward what the Lord intended marriage to be. Jesus clarifies it in the Gospels of Matthew and Mark. Jesus says the one who divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery. Those are Jesus' words. Now, how we can mitigate the truth of that is beyond me. I think we can develop approaches to people that encourage them to come and talk to us, rather than say there's really nothing to talk about. And I know that many, many years ago, for instance, if a Jewish person wanted to marry a Catholic person, it was not unusual for the parish priest to tell them, this, just forget it, just leave the church, you're all finished. And some even went as far as to say you're going to hell. Now, there is a way the Jewish and Catholic people can marry. They can have very beautiful, wonderful marriages. But they have to feel free from fear to come to the priest. Right. And the pastoral thing is to free the people from fear. Pastoral, the best synonym for pastoral in my world is patient. And that means we've got to know the direction we're going in, but we don't have to know it this minute. We can approach this in a way that it is revealed to you what direction we're going in such way as that you're able to accept it bit by bit.
We keep hearing this argument, and Cardinal Marks made it, others have made it, even here in the United States, I've heard it repeated, that this question of Cardinal Casper's proposal, this is no change in doctrine. No one is talking about the indissolubility of marriage. That will remain as it is. We are talking merely about the discipline of the reception of the Eucharist. And you can change that without changing the doctrine.
Well, I don't think that's possible because, again, the discipline embodies the doctrine. And
it's the lived doctrine.
Someone who is living in adultery can receive communion or they cannot. And Jesus seemed to be very clear that someone who is living in adultery is not in proper relationship to him and to the church because of that, because it's a public thing. It's a public thing, and therefore those problems, however they develop, need to be solved in a public way, that is, through a tribunal. And it cannot be left in any way to be subjective, so that I would fill out a form, say, and send it to my pastor, and say, I am sure that my marriage was invalid.
Right. Well, I'm also concerned about those who are left behind, the
Yeah.
wife and children
Yes.
left behind as a result of this marriage. I mean, it's very nice that Daddy went and found a nice younger model who he now wants to take to church. The question is, what about Mom and the kids left at home?
That's
Don't
right.
Shouldn't they be entitled, in justice, to a proper hearing?
Yes. Yes.
And it seems this whole formula misses that. It has no consideration for the largely women and children being left behind.
Well, it seems to me essentially confusing to say that we're going to change the discipline which embodies this doctrine, but we're not going to change the doctrine. It's almost like a mind-body split.
Yeah.
You know, the doctrine is lived out in its embodiment in the discipline. You can't, and for sure people say, well, if I can do this, that means...
They'll infer other things.
Yes.
Before we go, I got to read this to you. This is Cardinal Raymond Burke in an interview with French television. I'll put the quote up. He said, they said, but if Pope Francis insists on this path, what will you do? The path we were just discussing. He says, I will resist. I cannot do anything else. Now, later he clarified those remarks and he said, no authority can absolve me from that responsibility, my sacred duty to defend the truth of the Church's teaching and the discipline regarding marriage. And therefore, if any authority, even the highest authority, were to deny that truth or act contrary to it, I would be obliged to resist in fidelity to my responsibility before God. How do you react to that?
Who named him to be a bishop? I agree with that completely. I do not think, though, that Pope Francis will take that path, and I don't think Cardinal Burke thinks so either. That's a hypothetical.
Yeah, he said that. It's a hypothetical.
But I think he's going to certainly conserve the truth of the faith. I don't think that the Holy Spirit is going to allow the truth of the faith to be confused to that degree. Because when we're talking about marriage, we're talking about the very core of society. You know, the first of all communities. And if we get totally confused about that, even doctrinally in the official teaching of the Church, then I think all is lost for society.
Okay. Well, we will check in with you certainly before the Synod, but after as well. Bishop
Indeed.
Morlino, thank you
Always
for
a joy.
being here.
Always
Thank you.
a
To
joy.
keep up with Bishop Morlino's columns, you can go to madisondiocese.org.